January 17, 1945, somewhere between the shattered forests of the Ardennes and the cold silence of a makeshift American interrogation tent, the young woman sits with her hands folded in her lap, her grey wool uniform still dusted with snow. Her name is Greta Hoffmann, 22 years old, a member of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service. She does not look like a soldier, she does not carry a weapon, but her eyes hold something the American captain across from her has seen 100 times before in this war. Exhaustion so deep it has replaced fear. Outside, the wind howls through the pines. Inside, a small kerosene heater hisses in the corner. She does not speak, she does not need to. The trembling of her fingers says everything. For 4 years, girls like Greta had been told they were building the future. They were not merely workers, they were architects of a new order, servants of the Volk, disciples of duty. They dug ditches, harvested potatoes, cleared rubble, and sang songs about sacrifice. They wore their uniforms with the same pride the soldiers wore theirs. They had been promised meaning, they had been promised purpose. But by the winter of 1945, as the Reich crumbled around them, many had come to realize what they truly were. Tools, discarded when broken, forgotten when no longer useful. And now, in the chaos of Allied advance, thousands of these young women found themselves caught between armies, between ideologies, between the propaganda they had believed and the reality they could no longer deny. Many wanted only one thing: to go home. But home no longer existed. The villages they remembered had been bombed, occupied, or erased from the map. Their families were scattered, their futures obliterated. And so, quietly, without ceremony or headlines, the Americans began arranging their return. The girls of the Reichsarbeitsdienst had not volunteered for glory. The labor service had been compulsory since 1939, mandatory for all German women between the ages of 17 and 25. It was sold to them as a rite of passage, a civic duty no less noble than military service. They were told they would serve 6 months, sometimes a year, before returning to normal life, to marriage, to motherhood, to the quiet rhythms of peacetime. But the war stretched on. 6 months became 12, 12 became 24. The promises faded, the songs grew hollow. By 1943, these girls were no longer planting gardens in the countryside. They were repairing bomb-damaged railroads, digging anti-tank trenches along the Siegfried Line, and clearing the bodies of air raid victims from the rubble of German cities. They worked 12-hour shifts in frozen fields and slept in unheated barracks. They ate watery soup and stale bread, their hands bled, their backs ached, and still they were told to smile, to sing, to believe. The propaganda films showed them laughing in the sunshine, arms linked, marching in neat columns. The reality was frost-blackened fingers, dysentery, and the constant gnawing fear that the front would reach them before the war ended. And in the winter of 1944, when the Western Allies broke through into Germany, that fear became fact. Greta Hoffmann had expected purpose. She found only chaos. She had joined the labor service in the summer of 1941, when Germany still seemed invincible. Her older brother was in the Wehrmacht, her father a party functionary in a town near Cologne. She had believed, truly believed, that her work mattered. She had dug vegetable patches for military hospitals, repaired roads for supply trucks, and listened to radio speeches promising that every shovelful of dirt brought the Reich closer to victory. But by the time she was reassigned to the West Wall fortifications in late 1944, the speeches had stopped making sense. The soldiers they worked alongside no longer believed either. They were teenagers and old men, conscripts with hollow eyes and stolen boots. They did not joke. They did not sing. They simply waited. And when the Americans came, pouring across the Belgian border in a roar of tanks and artillery, the Labour girls were left behind. No evacuation orders, no transport, no plan, just confusion, and then silence, and then surrender. Greta had spent 3 days hiding in a farmhouse cellar with 11 other girls before the Americans found them. She had expected violence. She had been told for years what the enemy would do to German women. But when the GIs opened the cellar door, they brought chocolate bars and cigarettes and asked, in broken German, if anyone was hurt. One soldier, a boy who looked no older than her brother, helped her to her feet and said, "It's over now. You're safe." She did not believe him. Not then. But weeks later, sitting in that interrogation tent, she began to understand that he had been telling the truth. The Americans had not planned for this. The Allied command structure had prepared for armed resistance, for partisan attacks, for sabotage and espionage. They had not prepared for thousands of unarmed German girls stranded in occupied territory, begging to be sent home. The military government officials, fresh from training courses in civil administration, found themselves facing a humanitarian crisis no one had anticipated. These girls were not prisoners of war, they were not combatants. They were, in the cold, bureaucratic language of the occupation, displaced civilian personnel. But that language did not capture the desperation. It did not capture the letters they wrote, dozens every day, pleading for information about their families. It did not capture the way they stood at the gates of refugee camps, clutching photographs of children they had not seen in years. And it certainly did not capture the quiet horror that settled over the American officers who read their service records and realized how young they had been when the Reich conscripted them. Captain Robert Fisher, a civil affairs officer attached to the Ninth Army, later wrote in his diary, "These girls believed. They truly believed. And now they don't know what to believe anymore. They ask us if we're going to put them on trial. They ask if their families are dead. They ask if Germany will even exist when this is over. I don't have answers. All I can do is put them on trucks and hope there's something left for them to go home to." And that, quietly, is what the Americans did. There were no headlines, no photographs in Life magazine, no radio broadcasts celebrating mercy. The operation was logistical, not symbolic. Officers coordinated with the Red Cross, with Allied transport units, with German civil administrators in occupied zones. They verified identities, cross-referenced names with missing persons lists, and arranged convoys. Trucks carried the girls eastward, back toward the ruins of the Reich, back toward towns that no longer had roofs, or windows, or running water. Some were reunited with their families, many were not. But they were given the chance to try. The process was slow, frustrating, and deeply unglamorous. It involved paperwork, ration cards, medical screenings, and endless waiting. The girls slept in converted schoolhouses and warehouses, guarded not by barbed wire but by exhaustion. They were fed American rations, canned meat, powdered milk, white bread, and many cried when they tasted food that did not taste like sawdust and desperation. They were given soap, clean clothes, and blankets. And they were told, over and over, that they were not criminals, they were not monsters. They were simply young women who had been used by a regime that did not care whether they lived or died. This was not forgiveness, it was not redemption, it was something quieter, recognition. Recognition that ideology had consumed a generation, that propaganda had devoured innocence, and that the girls sitting in those makeshift camps were both victims and participants in a system that had destroyed itself. Greta Hoffmann returned to Cologne in March of 1945. The city she remembered no longer existed. The cathedral still stood, skeletal and blackened, but the streets around it were rubble. Her family's apartment building was gone, replaced by a crater filled with rainwater. She found her mother living in the basement of a bombed-out factory, surviving on charity and scavenged vegetables. Her brother was missing, presumed dead, somewhere on the Eastern Front. Her father had been arrested by the Allies, awaiting denazification hearings. She did not speak much about the Labour Service. She did not speak much about the war at all. But in 1952, during an oral history project conducted by a German university, she was asked what she remembered most clearly from those final weeks in American custody. She thought for a long time before answering. "The kindness," she said. "I did not expect kindness. I expected punishment. I expected anger. But they treated us like people. They gave us food and blankets and told us we could go home. I think that broke something in me. Some part of the story I had been told my whole life. Because if the enemy is supposed to be cruel and they are kind, then what does that make you?" The symbolic object of this story is not a weapon or a medal, it is a blanket. Wool, olive drab, stamped with US military markings. Thousands of them were distributed to German Labour Service girls in the winter of 1945. They were standard issue, utilitarian, designed for warmth rather than comfort. But for the girls who received them, they represented something far more profound. The idea that survival was still possible, that the future had not been entirely erased, that someone, even an enemy, believed they deserved to live. Many of those blankets were carried home, folded carefully, kept for decades. They became heirlooms, not out of nostalgia, but out of memory. Memory of the moment when the ideology shattered. Memory of the moment when the propaganda could no longer explain why the enemy was feeding them instead of punishing them. Memory of the moment when they realized they had been lied to about everything. The Americans did not arrange the return of these girls because they were saints. They did it because it was practical, because it was humane, and because it was the right thing to do. There was no grand strategy, no political calculation, no public relations campaign. It was simply men and women exhausted by war, recognizing exhaustion in others and choosing not to add to it. It was officers who had daughters at home, looking at German girls the same age and deciding that punishment could wait while mercy acted. It was the quiet, unglamorous work of reconstruction, putting human beings back together, one blanket, one meal, one truck convoy at a time. And in the larger story of the war, this moment is barely a footnote. It does not appear in the histories of great battles or diplomatic summits. It does not define the Allied victory or the Nazi defeat, but it defines something else, the difference between systems that saw people as material and systems that saw them as individuals. The difference between an ideology that consumed its daughters and a democracy that, even in victory, chose not to. The war ended 3 months after Greta Hoffmann returned to Cologne. The Reich collapsed. The Labour Service was dissolved, the uniforms were burned or buried, and the girls who had worn them tried, in the decades that followed, to make sense of what they had lived through. Some spoke openly, most did not. The shame was too deep. The complicity is too complicated. They had not killed anyone. They had not tortured or executed or betrayed. But they had served, they had believed. And that belief, more than any individual act, was the wound that never fully healed. But in those final weeks, as the trucks rolled eastward through the shattered landscape of the Third Reich, something else happened. A small, quiet recognition that even the most totalizing ideology could not erase the fundamental fact of human vulnerability. That even in the collapse of everything they had been taught, there was still the possibility of return. Not to innocence. Innocence was gone forever. But to something simpler and perhaps more important, the chance to begin again. The Americans did not save these girls, they did not absolve them, but they gave them what the Reich never had, the choice to go home. And in the wreckage of 1945, that choice was everything.